can mute people.
All right, so I know Deedy has had a lot of important positions in our society. She's really dedicated a lot of her time. She founded, am I correct, the New Braunfels chapter of the Native Plant Society and served as the president there. She is the lead on the state invasive plant committee, so this lady knows what we're talking about, and I'm going to stop there and turn it over to her. Thank you so much for coming today, Deedy.
All righty, thank you. All right, let's see if I can share screen. All right. All righty, thank you very much. This is one of my passions. Not that I love invasives, I don't. That's my passion. I don't love them. And I would like for us to be able to do something about them. This picture is the bastard cabbage or mustard. I've heard it called many different names. And it's taking us. This is one of the ones that was one of the first that really came to my attention. So I'm being invaded. What can I do? Well, there are lots of things that you can do. First of all, let's get a definition. And this is our official NPSOT definition from our committee. It is a species that is non-native to a particular region or environment and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. It's kind of a long, involved, but it goes along with the legal definition that the state of Texas Agriculture Commission uses. So we're matching them, and they are the official on this. So why are they here? Well, many reasons. We humans like things that are unique. And I can remember the gardeners in my family that used to talk down about, oh, it's just a native plant, it's a weed. They wanted something different, and that's what they planted. And also, natives tend to be different from the invasives, and they want that look of evergreen, which many of our natives don't have. Or they want great big flowers, which, again, many of our natives don't have, because both of those things take a lot of energy to be evergreen and to have great big flowers. And many of our natives are growing in situations where you don't have that kind of resources. In order to produce these plants, they need to be easy to grow and cheap to grow. And so the nurseries can produce them en masse. If you've gone to a big box store, you've seen that. And because they can be evergreen and they can have big bright flowers, they have a niche that our natives can't fill. So people go for them. And then some of them remind people of, quote, home. And I found it interesting that our nursery industry labeled the Vitex the Texas lilac, because I know from having a lot of folks around me that moved here from up north, they miss their lilacs because they won't grow here. So we have the Texas lilac, and I think it has been one heck of a marketing plan. They've sold well. So that's why we've got them. Why should you care? Well, many reasons. First of all, they cost you money, because now the $100 million was a figure from several years ago. I'm sure it's more now, but that's what it costs us in tax money to clear parklands, to maintain the roadsides. It's a lot of money that we could spend better, I think. And then the big thing that we are all concerned about as members of the Native Plant Society is that they damage our environment, because they don't have any of the normal controls that our natives have, and thus they can just grow like mad. So they can take over. And as we talk about these individual invasives, one of the themes you're going to hear me saying is that it farms a monoculture. It changes the environment so our natives can't grow. It's just, over and over and over again, because that's how these things do it. But they have no normal controls that nature puts in, because they're not in their natural ecosystem. And when they do that, they take over, they decrease biodiversity, which we know is important, and they don't serve our wildlife well. A few give a little bit of help, but for the most part, these invasives do not help our wildlife, and they don't provide the ecosystem services like water cleaning and so on that our natives do. So that's why you need to care about these dudes. What makes it invasive? Well, basically, they tend to be plants that can grow about anywhere. They're not picky, so they're generalist. They can reproduce at one heck of a rate, and they can use many different ways to reproduce. They can have seeds, they can have berries, they can have rhizomes, they can have root sprouts, and they tend to produce lots of seeds, and the viability is very high, so a lot of them germinate. I still laugh at people when I talk about Nandina. Oh, well, I don't have any of those coming up in my yard. My Nandina plant doesn't do that. And it's like, well, yes, it does, because it's coming up in my yard where something ate it and deposited it. So one of those problems, we don't always see what's happening with the invasive we may have in our yard. So who decides what's invasive? Legally, it's the Texas Department of Agriculture. They have a noxious and invasive plant list, and that link is in some of the resources that I sent y'all. It's a fairly short list, sadly. There are a lot of things like Nandina that ought to be on it. But there are other groups. Texas Parks and Wildlife has a very extensive list, the prohibited exotic species. The USDA Forest Service has another large selection, and there's a lot of overlap here. Different cities, such as Austin, have got their list of invasives, and Austin does have a management plan that they publish. USDA plants database will have these in it, and of course we are now forming it in our Native Plant Society. So there are lots of lists. The only one that's official is the Department of Agriculture. Now, why they break it out into invasive and noxious, I do not know. And I tried to find the difference, and I could not find it. But some of the ones that are listed as invasive, the Chinese tallow, which if you've been down in the Houston area, you have really seen this. It used to be planted widely. Kudzu. Fortunately, kudzu hadn't gotten here. It tends to be more to the east of us. Salt cedar, we do have some of those along our riparian areas. And the tropical soda apple. I don't think that's common around here, but these are on the list. That's why I'm telling you about them. And then what is noxious? Whatever the difference is. The Brazilian pepper tree, I don't think is real big around here, but the giant reed, or the Arundinodonax, is along our waterways, and it's bad. Hydrilla, which is one Parks and Wildlife really goes after because it grows in water and it can just take over. The same with Salvinia. Torpedo grass, water hyacinth, and a whole bunch more. So if you want to see that list on your resources that I sent, you will find a link to that page. And considering how many invasives you see on everybody else's site, it's a pretty short list. And getting things on it is extremely difficult. So how many plants are invasive? 30, according to TDA. And then we have the other lists, and I do have links to those lists if you want to look them up. Many of them, the USDA Forest Service has really nice pictures and instructions on how to get rid of a lot of these things. Okay, we're going to look at invasive plants. Now, at the bottom of the page in the box, I have the official disclaimer that those of us working on NLCP several years ago learned about. And it states very clearly that this plant list that we're about to talk about is only a recommendation and has no legal effect in the state of Texas. It's lawful to sell, distribute, import, or possess a plant on this list unless the TDA labels it noxious or invasive, and that's according to that plant list. So I'm going to be talking about a whole lot of plants that are not on that list. If they are, you will see an asterisk beside their name when we get to that page. So that's my official disclaimer, which we are supposed to state. All right, first off, Chinese tallow. It is on the list, and it ought to be. It is really, really bad in riparian areas and wetlands because it can change the pH of the water when its leaves and debris fall into bodies of water. It will enrich it, and that causes algae growth. And when you have algae growth, it covers over the water so that the sunlight doesn't get down to help the animals and the plants that should be growing there. So it can mean that all aquatic life is killed out. Its leaves, its fruits, and its sap are all toxic to humans and most animals. And it forms monocultures. This particular picture that you see here was taken in one of the city parks here in New Braunfels, and it is growing beside a lake. So we know that there are other problems going on. Now, what could you plant instead? Well, there are several alternatives because people often planted the Chinese tallow tree for its fall color. It's very dependable. So some trees that you could use that are native would be the cedar elm, which oftentimes has very nice golden color in the fall. The big tooth maple, which is maybe a little more reliable on its color in the fall. The Texas red oak is pretty reliable, giving you pretty red color. And the Texas redbud, which actually gives you color twice. It'll give you the blooms in the spring, and it will give you the golden leaves in the fall. The redbud is a little bit smaller than many of the tallows, but the other trees are fairly comparable to the size of a tallow tree. The China berry. This was one of my favorites as a kid because of the berries. We used to have China berry fights, and we would get the pea shooters that you could buy at the dime store and just kill each other with them. Little did we know those things were toxic, but we didn't eat them, so it didn't matter. This tree does bloom in the spring. It has a lavender bloom that's very fragrant, and then it sets berries, which are many. Eaten by birds, and if birds eat too many of them, it can kill them because these do have a level of toxicity. The leaves of this tree have chemicals that makes it hard for insects to digest them, so they don't tend to have caterpillars of any kind. And this again can form monocultures. We have a bunch of them here in New Braunfels along in riparian areas. Funniest thing. So another tree, and it is on the invasives list. It's a fairly recent addition. Alternatives. Probably the best would be the western soapberry because it has a berry very similar to the China berry, except its berry is translucent, whereas the berry on the China berry is not. You can't see through it. Size-wise, it's very similar. But the Texas red oak would also be a good substitute, as would the chinkapin oak, which is a fairly fast-growing tree and probably pretty similar in size to a China berry. The tree of heaven. This is one of the most invasive trees in the U.S. I have, my mother used to live in Victoria, my aunt lived in Houston, and these things came up everywhere. If you had one in the neighborhood, everybody got to enjoy them in time. It produces a chemical that prevents anything from growing around it. So it can kind of mark out its area. It has a very aggressive root system that can go underneath pavement and sewers and buildings and cause problems as they get larger and expand and press upward. So it's not good. It's not a good tree, but it does produce, you can see in that upper left-hand photo, those are the seeds, and they are distributed by wind. So they go everywhere. They float everywhere. Replacements. Once again, the western soapberry is very similar in size and leaf structure. and the pecan, which would give you some good nuts, that you could actually eat. It has the more complex leaf structure that the tree of heaven has got. So that would be another good replacement. The golden rain tree is lovely. I was horrified when I'm a TCU grad. I went on the campus several years ago in the springtime, and they had these dudes planted. Oh, you gods, they were in many of the parking lots, and I was just shaking my head going, I can't believe it. Are they beautiful? Yes, they are. These golden blooms are just gorgeous, but there's a downside. Once again, their roots produce chemicals that will keep other things from growing around them. So that means no natives are going to grow in the vicinity. And they produce root sprouts, so they can pop these little babies up all around them and produce something of a thicket. So not a good tree. Not particularly tall. It's a shorter tree. So the replacements would be the Texas redbud, which would give you flowers in the spring, although these are more of a purpley red, not yellow, but it also gives you the good fall color. And the American smoke tree, which also has a burgundy-ish flower to it. So you would have the color, just not the same color. And they're both smaller trees, similar to the golden rain tree. The Chinese parasol tree. This one is, I took this picture in my neighborhood. There's a lady that has this growing in her yard. It spreads freely. It forms colonies from its, you can see the kind of reddish things on it. Those are seeds, and they fly. They come off and are blown around by the wind. So if they get into water, they can float on the water and go down wherever and sprout. It also does root sprouts. So this tree, like many of the invasives, can reproduce by multiple methods and become a real problem. Alternatives would be the American sycamore, about the same size, and the bur oak, which has the coolest acorns in the world if you like to do dried arrangements. Those monsters are just gorgeous. Again, similar in size and structure to the parasol tree. The white mulberry, this one is a real problem because it can cross over with our native mulberry. And in fact, many botanists are afraid that we're going to lose our native because they're going to hybridize. And that's sad, because our mulberry, our native mulberry, is really good for the environment. Now, birds have learned to eat the mulberries off this tree. I found conflicting information about the fruit from the white mulberry. Some say that it is mildly poisonous and should not be eaten. And then another site was going, oh no, it makes great jam. So I don't know what to say. I tried finding someone who was really authoritative and couldn't come up with it. But this tree aggressively colonizes. Its seeds can be spread in those little berries by the birds. So that's kind of by the wind. They fly around and drop them. It hybridizes with our native mulberry, and it threatens to totally replace it, which is not good, but it's hard to prevent. They are difficult to remove because they have one heck of a taproot. And so getting rid of them is quite an ordeal. So replacements would be our native, the red mulberry, which has nice fall color. It has berries that are edible. Or the hackberry, about the same size, a good bird tree. I know we all love to hate hackberries because they come up everywhere, but that's because the birds eat them. And for migrating birds, the hackberry is a wonderful tree. We really do need it. So those would be good replacements for the white mulberry. The vitex, the chase tree, or the Texas lilac. This one's been around for a long time. but it has really spread when the master gardeners and A&M decided to make it a Texas superstar. Is it tough? Yes, it is. The highway department has planted it for years. It does do well, but it is especially invasive in riparian areas. And the San Antonio River Authority has a story about how they found out just how invasive this dude can be. Several years ago, along the San Antonio River in downtown San Antonio, they expanded it up toward the museums, and they designated that the museum reach. And along that area, they planted a lot of vitex. They were there for several years, had grown, and we had a huge rain, a big flood. And meanwhile, the River Authority had been developing the downstream part of the San Antonio River on the Mission Reach, which was south of town. And after that flood had receded, all of a sudden, thousands, hundreds of thousands of little vitex seedlings started sprouting on the Mission Reach, which was several miles from where the trees were growing. And the River Authority had to recruit volunteers and their own people to get in there and get those seedlings while they could, or they would have had a forest of vitex. So the main problem with the vitex is it can spread very easily if the seeds are anywhere near a riparian area, or if you have it close to a drainage system that would drain into a creek or a river. So it's something to be careful of. Now, I'm having a conversation with my daughter and her husband in Corpus right now. They bought a new house. They have a vitex. They love it because the hummingbirds love it. And it is true. The hummingbirds do use this tree. So, oh well. But it's a relatively small tree. So, replacements. Actually, there are quite a few that look fairly similar. The red buckeye, which obviously has red blooms on it, and larger leaves than the vitex, but again, kind of sort of the same. The Mexican buckeye, which I know does really well up in y'all's area, has that beautiful spring bloom and the great big seeds on it. The desert willow, which is a real survivor and comes in all colors, all the way from almost white to the dark burgundy that they call Bubba. And the anacacho orchid, which has the white flowers on it. These are all smaller trees, large shrubs, small trees that would be a good and an environmentally friendly replacement for the vitex. Salt cedar, these are a huge problem, especially along the Rio Grande, but along any riparian area, because these dudes have really, really deep roots that will go down and seek out the water tables. And one of the problems is that means they can survive in really arid areas and not just survive, but thrive. Then they tend to concentrate salt in their tissues of their bush, their tree. And whenever they lose that foliage, it gets into the soil, and over the years, it makes the soil around them salty. And there aren't many natives that like to grow in salty soil. So it means that they will get rid of anything other than salt cedar in the area. Now, you'll notice there are several different varieties, and they're all pretty similar. So they, in most books, just list them all together under salt cedar. But it's basically a large shrub or a small tree. It outcompetes all of our natives because it can get that dark, that deep taproot. Maybe not mesquite. Mesquite could probably go down there too, but the saline soil can defeat a lot of things. So what can we plant in its place? Well, the desert willow, which looks fairly similar. It has the smaller leaves. It has the purplish, or it can have purplish blooms. It doesn't have to. It may have white. Or the Texas redbud, which again is a smaller tree. It does have the lavender bloom, or the reddish bloom, similar to the salt cedar. and both are very friendly to our environment. Scarlet firethorn, or pyracantha. This is one that behaved itself for a while, and now all of a sudden it's not. It produces lots and lots of red berries in the fall, which are lovely. But if you have ever had to deal with one of these plants, they have mean thorns on them. And if you get stuck by that thorn, it festers. It's mean. And what they do, they crowd out our natives so they can become dominant. And they tend to fill in the understory under larger trees. They grow at the edge of forests, which is that forest edge between forest and grasslands is a very fertile area for our natives. So it's bad news when these things get in there. And to get rid of them is tough because they are persistent, and those thorns, they're really bad. But the birds eat them and then distribute them. So what could we plant instead? Well, the Yaupon holly. It has red berries on it. It gets larger, very similar to the pyracantha. The evergreen sumac, which again, evergreen, which is good. And it has kind of dark red purplish drupes in the fall, which the birds like. The possum haw holly, which is the deciduous holly. I have one in my backyard, which the birds absolutely adore, and it has those red berries all over it. So these are wonderful substitutes for the pyracantha that do good for the environment. The large leaf privet. These are from China, and I think people here consider them to be pass-along plants. Now, they're heritage plants because they've been here forever, but they are not native, and people are amazed when you say, no, it's not native. It can be cut down. They are hard to get rid of, very hard to get rid of. And you'll see they have these clusters of the dark berries, which the birds do eat. And if I used to have a white fence, and the birds would do their business and stain the fence after they ate those berries, which is not very good. There's also a variety of the privet that has the variegated leaves. They're all basically the same. And they can form monocultures and get rid of all of the natives that are around them. They do have chemicals in their leaves that interferes with insects' digestion, so insects don't tend to eat them. And their pollen is really bad if you have bad allergies. The pollen kind of looks like, if you see it magnified, kind of looks like a sticker burr. It's bad. They grow fast. They shade out everything else. They also produce root sprouts, which means they can form a thicket pretty fast. And birds are probably their biggest dispersal effort. We have a perfect example of a ligustrum forest not too far from my house, and there's literally nothing growing on the ground. It is bare. So what can you use instead? Well, if you have deep soil, the cherry laurel is a great substitute. It's evergreen. It produces little cherries that the birds love. The evergreen sumac, again, evergreen. It produces the drupes in the fall and spring. In the spring, they have the flowers. Or the southern wax myrtle, which is also evergreen. And it has little tiny kind of blue-black berries in the fall that the birds like. All of these are good for birds to nest in, too. So these are good for the environment. Ligustrum, which has a special category. It's Japanese, obviously. The name gives it away. This was one of my mother's favorite plants. She adored these things, and she really, really, really loved the smell of the blooms, which I never could put up with. And I think I am allergic to the dudes. Their pollen is very irritating for those who have allergies. It can shade out other plants. It produces the large clusters of the dark berries, which the birds will eat and spread. I pull them out of my yard regularly because there are a bunch of those things around me. And it's difficult to kill. It takes real persistence to get rid of these. So it's one of the situations where you oftentimes have to use chemicals, which I don't like to do, but sometimes you don't have much choice if you want to get rid of them. So this is one of them. So replacements, again, the cherry laurel. It's evergreen, has the little berries on it. Barbados cherry is another one that I was amazed. I have them in my yard, and they came through Snowmageddon last year. I thought they were dead, but lo and behold, those dudes made it. And they are from a little further south, so I was impressed. But they will have the pretty pink blooms and the little red manzanitas, or little apples on them, which mockingbirds dearly adore. They bloom in flushes, so it's not just one big bloom, but it will bloom repeatedly after rains. The Mexican silk tassel is another possibility, not quite as well known, but worth growing. So these are some possibles that you could use, and you could use these in hedges, like you can use the Japanese Ligustrum. I didn't know for years that this wasn't native, because this is what my grandmother grew. It wasn't until a few years ago I realized, no, it's not. This is native to the West Indies and South America. And it grows everywhere. It is rampant. It can form thickets, and I have seen some around here. Their berries are poisonous, as is our native. You don't want to go around eating lantana berries. But if livestock eat the berries off of this, it can be fatal if they eat enough of them, and it's not good for humans either, especially children. It will release chemicals from its roots and stems that prevent other things from growing around it, so that it can take over. And it can suppress the growth, so it just keeps moving out by putting out more toxic chemicals into the soil, preventing more native plants. And if you've noticed, if you've seen in some rather uncared for areas, it's really thick. And it's pretty persistent and hard to get rid of. So there's just one good alternative, and that is our Lantana Erdocoides, which is the yellow, orange, and red. Now, what I was told lately is that the nursery industry, in all of its wisdom, has now produced a hybrid using the Lantana camara as the base, and it looks just like our native. Wonderful. So it used to be you could tell by the color of the flowers. You didn't have to go any further, but that's not true anymore. And I think, as I have watched one lantana that I have in my yard, I think I have inadvertently bought one of them at one of our nice nurseries in the area, and I don't think she was aware of it either, because so many of these don't come with the botanical name on them. So ask questions when you buy what you think is a Texas native lantana. It may be a hybrid. If it's a hybrid, then you don't want it. So I don't know why they do that. If you've already got one that color, why do you need to develop another? But I don't work in the horticulture industry. Whatever. Heavenly bamboo. I don't know who came up with that name, but it's not so heavenly. This grows in my neighbor's yard next door. And she really doesn't like it very much, but it's so darn hard to get out, she's not going to dig it. So I told her, well, if nothing else, cut off the berries, which she doesn't. And I even warned her, because she's a cat person, and these berries can kill cats if they eat them. They contain cyanide, which is not good. And if songbirds eat too many of them, it can kill them also. So this is not a friendly plant. You want to, if you have grandkids or children, you want to discourage them from playing with those berries, because they do have cyanide in them. It is a bamboo. It invades with rhizomes. It forms thickets and monocultures, and it grows underneath a canopy. It can survive in that. And I know in Austin, they have had real problems in their parks and along riparian areas with this stuff coming in. And it is hard to get out. If you know anything about bamboo, it's not easy to get rid of. So this is a bad one. And of course, it is just sold everywhere at all the big box stores. So what can you use? Well, agarita is a good one. And agarita blooms early in the spring. It puts on berries that are pretty darn good to eat. Make good jelly if you can survive those prickly leaves. Dwarf yaupon, depending on what size of Nandina you have gotten, because it goes all the way, excuse me, it goes all the way from a little banana, the little bitty round, to pretty good sized trees. And so if you have the little bitty Nandina, the dwarf yaupon would fit very nicely because the dwarf Nandina doesn't produce berries either. Autumn sage, which is an evergreen and comes in various colors, but if you like the red, it does come in red. And it would be kind of a medium size Nandina replacement. And then for the really large, the yaupon holly, which again has the red berries on it and is good for the wildlife. So depending on what size Nandina you've got, there are some natives that would fit the bill. Japanese honeysuckle. Gosh, I remember as a kid, my mother loved this one too. She loved all the invasives. I remember sitting and pulling the flowers off and using your thumbnail to cut the stem and pulling the nectar out and eating it. We used to think that was so cool. And it is fun. But this one's a problem because it can get going and it can grow over and across anything and smother it. I have seen thickets of this stuff where it was just allowed to go and no control whatsoever. So it can form a monoculture of just this. It can spread very quickly and it can form a mat which gets heavy on taller things. And so when you have seedlings, tree seedlings that are, 3-4 feet high, and these things go over it, then it bends them over and they become deformed. So it wipes out everything. And it does alter the habitat for our wildlife. So what is a good replacement? Well, the coral honeysuckle, which is evergreen. Hummers love it, love the blooms, and then the berries, many of the birds like. So this is a very well-behaved honeysuckle. It is in the same basic family, but it's native to our area and does well. Another is the Carolina jessamine, and it will have a big flush of bloom in the spring. It is evergreen. Now, it is poisonous, so you do need to be careful with this. But I don't think it's anything that we really have to worry about that much, but it's a good replacement for an invasive. King Ranch bluestem. This grass was widely planted by the Texas Highway Department for many, many years, and they may still be planting it some places, I don't know. But this is one that comes in, forms a monoculture, and it has been devastating for our quail population and for grassland birds. It takes no prisoners. It wipes out all the grasses around it and can be pretty hard to get rid of. And I tried to get several pictures of it to give you an idea of what the seed head looks like, because that's probably the easiest way to identify it. What could you plant instead? Well, little bluestem, a much prettier grass. It's a bunch grass. Or the blue grama, which I've heard it called eyelash grass, because the seed kind of grows horizontally and has little things hanging off of it like an eyelash. So these would be two good replacements for the KR and would be good for our birds and our wildlife. Maiden grass, this one is widely used in the landscape trade. And I couldn't believe it. In one of our parks here in New Braunfels, they had Native American come in and plant a prairie up on the hill, but down by the buildings, they planted this grass. And the first director of the park was just appalled. He said, I can't believe they did that. And I said, yeah, when you've got the Lindheimer muley, which is Lindheimer in New Braunfels, and it's very similar grass in many ways in appearance. So this one is invasive. It will go into disturbed areas or along roads throughout the U.S., not just here. And it spreads by rhizomes. Of course, it also has seeds. Now, they said that many of the original were sterile, so the seeds weren't viable. But what they're finding, like many grasses, they do become viable over time. You know, all plants want to be able to reproduce and grow where they are and adapt, and these are doing it. So, native replacements, well, the Lindheimer muley would be a perfect one. It's large and it has those gorgeous seed heads in the fall. It is endemic to the Edwards Plateau, so it's perfect for our area. The silver bluestem would be another. It has the prettier seed heads on it. Indian grass is lovely. The color of that stuff in the fall is just exquisite with the golden seed heads and the kind of gray-green leaves. Our switchgrass, which again, kind of like the Lindheimer, it's a larger grass, and if you can get it backlighted by the sun, it is really, really pretty. So any of these, and I, again, don't understand why landscapers haven't latched onto these, but they haven't yet. So that's where we come in. Golden bamboo. There was a member of the San Antonio chapter that went to my church, and he moved into an older part of Alamo Heights. His next door neighbor had golden bamboo planted along the property line, and he didn't want it. He wanted only natives. He and his brother dug a 6-foot trench down his property line and cemented it to keep that bamboo out because the neighbor wouldn't get rid of it. And I think it worked. I think going down 6 feet, he was able to keep it out, but that's kind of extreme. But that kind of tells you what this stuff is like. It's tough. It spreads with rhizomes underground. It creates a monoculture. There'll be nothing else. You can see how thick that stuff is. Nothing can get sun. And it's really, really hard to get rid of. Our native animals and wildlife don't really have much use for it, so it's not good in the environment. So the Lindheimer muley would be another way you could use that. It gets fairly large. So does big bluestem. It's a larger grass that would form a barrier. Now, if you are using it as a large barrier, which the bamboo can be, the cherry laurel has a very different look, but it would serve the same purpose and it would be good for the environment. So if you're looking for the grassy look, the muley or the bluestem, if you're looking for a barrier, cherry laurel would work. Giant cane, giant reed, or Arundinodonax. This is all along our streams. And I was seeing they're making an effort along the Pedernales. It's starting to spread in that area, and I believe it's Parks and Wildlife that's been working with landowners along the Pedernales, starting way up at the head of it, not down at the bottom, and trying to eradicate this stuff so that they can kind of work their way down toward Lake LBJ and get rid of it. The problem with this is it alters water flow because it's very, very thick. And if you break off any part of it and it starts floating down the river or the water or the ditch or wherever it's growing, those can sprout. So you have to be very careful when you go in to remove it, because anything you break off and don't carry out can grow again. And you can, in essence, increase its spread when you go in to get rid of it. So you have to be very careful. It is very, very flammable and creates a very hot fire whenever it burns, which can then spread to other plants and wipe them out. And it forms monocultures. You know, you're hearing monoculture a lot because that's what these dudes do. But it gets tall. It can go up to 20 feet. It's a monster. So what do you plant? Nothing is as big as the giant cane. There is a native cane but it only grows in East Texas, so it wouldn't be any good around here. But again, the big blue stem, or if you really do have it in a watery area, the cattail would be a nice replacement. And you can use those in dried arrangements too. I've done that. So that would be a possibility. But this is one of those examples where there really isn't anything native that looks like the stuff. And so you're not going to be able to replace it one for one. The elephant ear. There is a huge push right now in the Comal River to get rid of this, and also the San Marcos River, because people said, oh, they're so pretty. Again, my mother loved these. She loved I swear, every invasive plant there was. But she had a lot of these in her yard. Now, she did not live in a riparian area, but these have the same problem that the Arundinodonax has, and that is, if you break off parts of them, it can resprout. Not guaranteed, but it can. So when you are removing them, you have to make sure that you remove everything, or you have simply made the problem worse. So these are pretty tough to get rid of. So what could you use? Well, there is the Delta Arrowhead, which has a somewhat similar leaf, not as large as the elephant ear, but a somewhat similar leaf. And it does have a nice bloom on it. I don't think elephant ears are known for their blooms. They do bloom though. Or the pickerel weed, which is a narrower leaf with a blue flower. And this would be another good one in a really wet area, like along the rivers. But they would serve our natives. And then here is Pam's favorite. This is the blue periwinkle, or the common periwinkle. I understand that there are several areas in the Kerrville area, that are using these as ground covers. And I know that Pam just loves them. Don't hit me, Pam. These are a problem because they form thickets, mats, that nothing else. You can see in that picture on the right, it's just thick. And they will grow in part shade, and they'll grow under trees, but nothing else can grow there. It wipes out everything, and these are really not particularly used by any of our wildlife. So there are some other things that you can plant. Frog fruit. Frog fruit is tough stuff. And the little butterflies and the little insects really do love those little flowers that it's got. And just a tip, you can use frog fruit in hanging baskets. It's pretty, I know everybody's laughing, but you can. It's really quite pretty. There is another plant that's pretty hard to find. It's the purple ground cherry. I would love to find some of this stuff, but it would be another replacement for the vinca. Our snake herb. I did find some snake herb, and I kind of like it. I had it in a pot for a while, and now I've got it in the ground, and it's frozen back, but it's coming back. It does bloom, has the blue blooms on it. So it's attractive and kind of a sprawly habit. So it forms kind of sort of a mat, but it's very nice. So what can be done? Well, you can contact your Native Plant Society or the Department of Natural Resources and find out which plants are invasive in your area. And you probably already know. You've probably already seen them and know what they are. You can learn to identify these important invasive plants, which again, I have a feeling most of you do already. And then you can get rid of those plants on your property. Or if you work with a public garden, you can get them out of there if you can, and put out the word that these are not good. And talk to neighbors. It's amazing when we talk to our friends and neighbors. If you can talk to city councils or parks departments about what they're doing in parks or along roads, it's amazing what we can get done. And I'm not going to go through all these. You have this resource list where you can look up a lot of things. So, questions?
Deedy, we had a request to talk about the Bradford Pair.
That has now become on the invasives list, and I really don't have a lot of information on it. I apologize. So I know it's one of those that started out as a supposedly sterile plant that would not reproduce, but over the years, it has learned how to reproduce. And so now we need to get rid of it. And I know in South Carolina, for instance, they offer a bounty to people that take them out. They actually pay them something to take out a Bradford Pair. It's like, wow, we're serious about this. I kind of wish that we had as aggressive a Department of Agriculture as evidently South Carolina does. So, I think a good replacement would be the Mexican plum. It's a tough little tree. It blooms similarly. It doesn't have that lollipop shape that the Bradford does, but it would be usable. Now, the one warning, I have got some Mexican plums in my landscape. If I were to do it again, I still like them. But let me tell you, when they start dropping fruit, it's messy. So I would have planted them somewhere else than where I did because I have them in a walkway, and that's unfortunate.
Okay, two other plants in the chat is Chinese pistache and also broomweed.
Chinese pistache is still being recommended by the Extension Service. It is on the invasives list of various groups. And this is one of the things that disturbs me about our Extension Service. They are still recommending that and other invasive plants. In fact, I was told by a forester when we lived in San Antonio to plant one, and I did. It's a lovely tree. And it wasn't until after we moved that I found out that it had been declared to be invasive. So there are a lot of them around, and they do produce a lot of seeds. I had a female, and it did. So we need to talk to A&M about invasives. In fact, the recommendation of plants like the Vitex is one of the reasons I'm no longer a master gardener. When they started offering specialties in teaching the Texas superstars, and quite a few of those are invasives, are non-natives, it's like, I can't do this anymore. I just can't. So I have since resigned. I was a master gardener for 15 years, and that pushed me over the edge. But they're still doing it. There was a grass that they have just put forward, and I can't remember the name of it. It's a reddish, burgundy-ish colored grass that gets like 6 feet tall. It's from Africa. And when I saw it, I Googled it, and it's invasive. It's ungodly invasive, and it's now a superstar. It's like, oh my Lord. So don't get me started. It's one of my
Another question we had is, why is it so hard to get plants listed on the Department of Agriculture's invasive and toxic list here in Texas?
Nurserymen and landscapers.
Okay.
There are many hoops you have to jump through, and I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, it was one of the guys who has since passed away from the Wildflower Center that got the China berry on the list, and that was a good many years back. It's at least 10 that he did it. There are many, many hoops. You can submit all the information. It has to go through all kinds of review, public comment, blah, blah, blah. It's very political. Very, very political.
Okay. Two other plants that are being asked about are the McCartney rose, which I guess is getting a hold in the river trail here in Kerrville.
Yeah.
And another question is, how can you tell the difference between the white mulberry and the native mulberry?
Okay. The only thing I know about the McCartney rose, I grew up in Victoria, and they had some rancher, and I can't remember which one it was, got those going. He was using them as hedgerows, which are quite effective. Nothing's going through them, but they have gotten everywhere. And if you go down to some places between Victoria and Edna, or coming into Victoria from Hallettsville, you will see huge mounds, or at least you used to. I don't know, they may have been taken out by now, but they were brought in to use as fences. The difference between the mulberries, now let me remember, one of them is fuzzy on the bottom and the other one isn't. And I think the native, the leaves are fuzzy on the bottom. Hang on. I thought I put that in my notes. No idea.
I think the white mulberry has a shinier leaf, if I remember correctly.
Now, the main thing that I was getting was the fuzziness, which I thought was kind of interesting. Hang on, let me go back to my notes.
And we do have someone in the chat window saying that they have a resource for telling the difference between the white and the red.
Okay, yeah, what is it?
I'm not sure, but if you would share that in the chat window, we can get that out.
Yeah.
To people. Also, broomweed. Can you talk to that a little bit, please?
I really don't know much about broomweed. Probably grasses are my weakest area, partly because I can't tell them apart.
Yeah, broomweed's a native plant that is often in overgrazed fields, but it can be by some birds for forage. So, you know, it's a management problem, but it is a native plant.
And we don't tend to classify our natives as invasive. They may be aggressive, but we don't tend to call them invasive because they are here. They are supposed to be here. They might have gotten out of hand, but they're not aliens. Yeah, what was how did you tell the difference between the mulberry?
She said the white has a shiny leaf. The fruits are different. There's hybrids. She's going to get that web link, and Kathy, if you could email that to us, that would be great, and we can put it in the comments when we load this up to YouTube.
Right, that would be good.
One of the plants that we've had trouble with is the thing called Roosevelt weed or poverty bush.
And that is a native.
I know it is. It's terrible.
It is prolific. In the right place, it's a good plant. And I've noticed that the city of Austin actually has listed it as one of the natives that they recommend. It is fast growing. It would be a shrub, fairly good sized shrub. And it does have a lot of blooms on it. So I have a feeling the pollinators would like it too.
Well, the butterflies love ours, but we've got a couple of areas that it's just really overtaken.
It goes into disturbed areas, but it is a native. Yeah, it just needs to be controlled. It's exuberant.
One of the things that we found, I use horticultural vinegar, on weeds in the walkway and stuff, but we had some muriatic acid from our swimming pool. Well, we have used that on stumps to help get rid of something. I'm wondering if that might help to destroy the vitex without using some kind of other chemical, because
herbicide,
hydrochloric acid, and it just is going to break down to hydrogen and chloride and
that's true.
Absorb into the soil.
It would be worth a try. When my other daughter moved into her house in Austin, there was an old vitex that was dying, and we cut it off and hit it with Roundup. And she had to it took her 2 years to kill that stump out. They are really persistent. But I hadn't thought about muriatic acid. Yeah.
You have to stand away from it, but
yeah.
We've used it on some stumps and it has actually been effective. So
well, and the agricultural vinegar will kill leaves. It won't kill roots. But if you hit stuff when it's pretty young and it doesn't have much of a root system, oftentimes one application will do it.
Right.
And it's much better for the environment than Roundup.
Right, definitely.
And I think we have one last question on, is there any evidence that crepe myrtle is becoming invasive?
It is breaking out of cultivation. Some of the seeds are now becoming viable and coming up. So it's been here for a long time. There was a chart, and I didn't include it in this, and I probably should have, that shows there was a study done of the privet. And it was brought in the, I believe, 1830, somewhere in that region. And they tracked it. How long did it stay in cultivation, and when did it begin to break out of cultivation? And it stayed, for 50, 60 years. It behaved itself, and then it began to break out. And once it began to break out, it was darn near a straight line up on the spread. And it just shows that it's a living creature. It grows. It can evolve. It did evolve. It adapted to its habitat, and it became able to move out. And it did. So these plants that they bring in, that they say, oh, well, they're sterile, they won't. Well, no.
Bradford Pair.
Exactly. Bradford Pair, prime example. They broke out. And I've heard oh, well, isn't the crepe myrtle native? Well, to India. Yeah. Really? I thought it was native to, nope. And I believe, if I'm not wrong, the crepe myrtle is one of our state shrubs. That's something we might want to go after.
Two quick things, and then we'll quit asking you questions. We've had a question about if you have to use an herbicide to take out something really tough, is there a recommended herbicide? And then we also recently had an ad in our local paper for the Empress tree. And if you have any comments on that, that would be great.
It's invasive. That's the first one. It's kind of like the other Chinese. It's Chinese. It's Empress, Princess, Pavlonia, has multiple names.
Right. The ad was quite seductive for it. So we're afraid we're going to see more of that around here very soon.
I'm afraid so. Pam sent me the ad, and I was going, oh man, this is the best thing since sliced bread, according to them. They just didn't add that final. And oh, by the way, it spreads freely. Yeah, it's bad. And the other question
was the herbicide, a recommended herbicide?
I don't know so much the herbicide as the method of application. Cheryl Hamilton, who's on our committee, is extremely experienced in eradicating invasives. And some of the methods that they use, I think, are very creative. For instance, if you're cutting down something where you're going to have a large stump and you don't want to spray because there's overspray, they would use a paintbrush and paint on the herbicide immediately, because many of these things, when you cut them, they immediately, within 10 minutes, will form kind of a skim, and the herbicide won't go through. They protect themselves. So whenever you cut down something like a ligustrum or anything with a stump, it is wise to have whatever you're going to use there immediately paint it. The other thing they have done, they have taken the smaller water bottles and cut the bottom off, and then use the part you'd be drinking out of to put the spray or into that, and then you put that cylinder down on the ground and spray whatever it is you want to kill, and it only goes there. There is no overblow, which I thought was very clever. So the main thing is, if you have to use a herbicide, use it so that it goes only where you need it. Avoid overblow, avoid killing other things when don't use it in a high wind. Don't use it if there's going to be rain soon. It needs to dry and be in place. And I think most of them say 12 to 24 hours before rain would be a possibility. I am not that up on the various kinds. And the ones that worry me the most are the ones that say they last for extended periods of time. If it's going to last for a year, ye gods, what else is it killing? And we also know that Roundup, for one, is bad for people if you get it on you. There are all kind of lawsuits now of it causing all kinds of problems, nerve problems. So it's nothing to be cavalier about. If you're going to use it, use protective gear, use it so that it doesn't produce a spray that can float over other places. I have had some neighbors evidently use it because I ended up with some plants that obviously had damage from a herbicide, and I didn't use it. So it can float a ways before it gets to whatever it is that it ends up on. So be very, very, very careful with it. I believe that Texas Invaders, I know that's what Cheryl has worked with for 15 or 20 years now. I believe on their website, they have instructions on how to best use herbicides when you must. And they admit there are times when you must. You can't get rid of them.
Okay, Pam, I don't know if you want to close us out, or it's been an extremely informative webinar, Deedy. We're so appreciative.
Well, I enjoy doing this, and I had good questions. I've got to bone up on some stuff now.
You have been great, and I think that we are most appreciative of your presentation. We all know some of it, but not all of it. So I think that you've been very thorough in everything that you have presented.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
No, thank you, Deedy. This is a really important topic, as we know by the Polonia being so a lot of work to do. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.